Good day, peasants. Let us plunge head first this utter catastrophe, the dreadfully dreary origins of James Matthew Barrie. Pour yourself a strong black coffee, no milk, no preposterous syrups, just pure bitter reality, and prepare for a saga of psychological fragility that is, without question, utterly pathetic. The miserable affair begins in the year 1860 in Kirriemuir, Scotland, a grim, joyless little weaving town that contributed absolutely nothing of value to the grand tapestry of the universe. Barrie was birthed into an absurdly oversized pedestrian brood. He was the 9th of 10 children. 10! Bloody hell! It is not a family. It is a veritable infestation of mediocrity. His father, David, was an entirely unremarkable weaver, and his mother, Margaret Ogilvy, was a woman who clearly possessed the emotional fortitude of a damp paper bag. The singular catalyst for this entire wretched timeline revolves around James's older brother, also named David. David was the undeniable golden child of the family, presumably because he managed to accomplish basic tasks without bursting into tears. However, just 2 days before his 14th birthday, David went ice skating. In a spectacular display of typical human clumsiness, he fractured his skull and promptly expired. Now, any rational, dignified species, such as my own, would mourn the loss, stiffen the upper lip, and proceed with the business of living. But humans? Absolute rubbish at coping. The mother, Margaret, took to her bed permanently, pulling the covers over her head, declaring her life essentially over, and entirely ignoring the gaggle of surviving offspring scurrying about her home. And how does our young James respond to this staggering maternal neglect? Does he forge his own path? Does he seek intellectual enrichment? Of course not. In a macabre, thoroughly disturbing bid for a crumb of validation, the boy decides the most logical course of action is to completely erase his own identity. He literally sneaks into his deceased brother's wardrobe, dons the dead boy's clothing, and begins wandering into his mother's darkened bedroom, whistling the exact tunes the departed David used to whistle. He memorized his dead sibling's posture and mannerisms. There is simply no otter way to frame this. It is the genesis of a complete psychotic break performed as a grotesque parlor trick for a delusional woman. He spent his formative years acting as a fleshy ghost. The psychological damage was so profound, so intensely ingrained, that Barrie's own physical development ground to a screeching, pathetic halt. The man literally stopped growing, capping out at a thoroughly unimpressive 5 feet and 3 inches, a condition often referred to as psychogenic dwarfism. He stunted his own biology because he was terrified of maturing past the idealized dead brother his mother worshipped. It is a spectacle of such monumental, unadulterated weakness that it makes my whiskers twitch with sheer disdain. This, you foolish mortals, was the absolute foundation of the man who would write your beloved, whimsical Peter Pan. A traumatized runt performing a morbid pantomime of a corpse because he couldn't handle the concept of puberty. Romantic, isn't it? Having successfully stunted his own physical and emotional growth in the miserable, rain-soaked lowlands of Scotland, our pint-sized protagonist decided to inflict his neuroses upon the literary circles of London. He began churning out utterly tedious novels and articles centered entirely around a fictionalized version of his dreary hometown, which he dubbed Thrums. It was absolute rubbish, of course, sentimental, treacly nonsense, yet the late Victorian public, demonstrating their usual lack of Disneying taste and intellectual rigor, eagerly devoured it. He became wealthy by selling the vacuous populace a romanticized lie about poverty and repressed Scottish weavers. But wealth, alas, cannot purchase emotional maturity. Enter Mary Ansell, a moderately successful actress whom Barrie met during the production of one of his early forgettable plays. In 1894, they wed. It is quite frankly appalling that he even pursued a romantic entanglement, given he possessed the romantic prowess and worldly experience of a damp sponge. Bloody hell, what a farcical union it was! It is a matter of historical record that the marriage remained entirely unconsummated. You heard me correctly, peasants. He took a bride and essentially treated her as a captive, ornamental mother figure. He had zero interest in the physical or emotional realities of adult companionship. Instead of fulfilling his duties as a husband, Barrie poured his entire pathetic emotional reservoir into a gargantuan St. Bernard named Porthos. He would strut about London parading this massive beast, dressing it up in ridiculous costumes and treating it with far more affection and reverence than he ever afforded his wife. He even dragged the poor animal on their honeymoon. There is simply no otter way to analyse this. Barrie was a colossal, walking failure of a man who preferred the uncomplicated loyalty of a dog to the demands of a human relationship. Mary, predictably starved of any normal affection or intimacy, existed in a state of quiet, suffocating misery for years in this sham of a household. Can anyone with a single functional brain cell blame her for eventually seeking the company of someone who actually behaved like an adult male? She embarked on an affair with a younger writer and associate of Barrie's, a chap named Gilbert Cannon. When Barrie finally stumbled out of his delusional fantasy world long enough to discover the betrayal, he was utterly scandalized. He, the man who treated his wife like a mildly annoying piece of furniture, had the audacity to play the victim. He demanded she end the affair immediately. Mary, having finally tasted a semblance of reality and genuine affection, quite rightly refused. The resulting divorce, in 1909, was a highly publicized, deeply humiliating spectacle of his own making. The dreary scribbler was left entirely alone, save for his canine companions and his increasingly unhinged imagination. The year is 1897. Barrie, trapped in his miserable, unconsummated marriage, develops a habit of wandering through London's Kensington Gardens. He is flanked, as always, by that gargantuan St. Bernard of his, Porthos. It is during these aimless, dreary strolls that he locks his sights onto young George and Jack Llewellyn-Davies, who are out walking with their nurse. Now, how does a supposedly respected adult author introduce himself? Does he offer a polite nod? Does he engage the nurse in civilized conversation? Bloody hell, of course not. The stunted little man begins performing infantile parlour tricks. He wiggles his ears. He dances with his dog. He contorts his face. He behaves with the dignity of a discarded jester to capture the attention of toddlers. Absolute rubbish. But it gets worse. Barrie discovers who their mother is, the beautiful and fiercely protective Sylvia Llewellyn-Davies. He then proceeds to orchestrate a campaign of accidental run-ins, essentially stalking the family through the park, until Sylvia has no choice but to acknowledge his existence. He wedges himself into their lives like a mould creeping up a damp wall. We must also discuss Sylvia's husband, Arthur Llewellyn-Davies, a hard-working barrister trying to provide for a family that would eventually swell to 5 boys, George, Jack, Peter, Michael, and Nico. How does Barrie treat Arthur? With staggering, barely concealed disdain. Barrie, armed with his newly acquired literary wealth, begins showering the boys with expensive toys, lavish dinners, and extravagant holidays to his country home, Black Lake Cottage. He effectively buys their affection usurping Arthur's role as the provider and father figure. He played pirates with them, dressed them up, and took thousands upon thousands of photographs of these children, eventually compiling them into a bizarre, privately printed book titled The Boy Castaways of Black Lake Island. He produced exactly 2 copies, one for himself and one he callously handed to Arthur, essentially rubbing his financial and emotional colonization of the family right in the poor man's face. There is simply no otter way to describe this phenomenon. It was an audacious, brazen infiltration. Barrie possessed the emotional maturity of a sea sponge, and therefore found the company of adult men threatening and incomprehensible. He preferred children because he could control the narrative, dazzle them with his wealth, and remain the perpetual, undisputed center of their universe as Uncle Jim. It is an utterly grotesque overstep of every conceivable social boundary, enabled entirely by a society that mistook his neurotic obsession for whimsical genius. The man was a parasite, feeding on the youthful energy of another family to sustain his own arrested development. The year is 1904. Having thoroughly plundered the youthful imaginations of the Llewellyn Davies boys, Barrie regurgitates their playtime games into a stage play titled Peter Pan, or The Boy Who Wouldn't Grow Up. It is a blatant, unapologetic manifesto of his own stunted psyche. The narrative centers on a deeply arrogant flying urchin who actively refuses to mature, dragging 3 unsuspecting children out of their nursery window to an island of perpetual warfare and arrested development. And let us examine the female representation, shall we? He introduces Wendy Darling not as a warrior or an explorer, but strictly to mend socks, tell stories, and serve as a surrogate mother to a tribe of feral abandoned boys. Because, heaven forbid, Barrie conceive of a female character who isn't immediately shoved into a miserable, maternal pigeonhole to coddle a man-child. It is quite frankly appalling. The play was mounted at the Duke of York's Theatre in London, and the production was an absolute circus of hazardous ineptitude. To portray the prepubescent boy, they cast Nina Boucicaut, a 37-year-old grown woman, to prance about the stage in tights. A preposterous visual, but I suppose it perfectly mirrored the sheer absurdity of the text. The actors were strapped into rudimentary, highly dangerous wire harnesses, violently yanked into the rafters by stagehands to simulate flying, dangling up there like incredibly clumsy, uncoordinated marionettes. It is an utter miracle nobody was decapitated. Then we have the villains. A pirate captain with a hook for a hand, pursued relentlessly by a crocodile that swallowed a ticking clock. A ticking crocodile. You cannot make up this level of infantile drivel. It is absolute rubbish, a lazy plot device cooked up by a mind terrified of the passage of time. But the most unforgivable, offensive moment of the entire wretched spectacle, the part that makes my aristocratic blood boil, is the climax involving that dreadful fairy, Tinker Bell. The fairy drinks poison to save Peter, and instead of letting natural selection take its course, Peter turns to the audience and begs them to clap their hands if they believe in fairies to save her life. And what did the supposedly sophisticated Edwardian audience do? Did they maintain their dignity? Did they throw rotten vegetables? Bloody hell no, they clapped. Grown, tax-paying human adults, weeping and slapping their fleshy appendages together to resuscitate a glorified stage prop light bulb. The collective intellectual failure of your species in that theatre was staggering. It was an utterly embarrassing display of mass delusion. The public lapped it up, showering Barrie with unimaginable wealth and cementing his delusion that refusing to grow up was a whimsical virtue rather than a profound psychological failing. The Grim Reaper, seemingly the only entity capable of imposing boundaries on James Matthew Barrie, arrives. In 1907, Arthur Llewellyn Davies, the exhausted usurped father of the boys, develops a sarcoma on his cheek and dies. Does Barrie step back to allow the family to mourn in peace? Bloody hell, no. He swoops in like a bespoke-suited vulture, solidifying his grip on the grieving household. Then, in a twist of fate that proves the universe possesses a remarkably cruel sense of humor, Sylvia develops cancer as well. She dies in 1910. Now, pay close attention to this next detail, for it is quite frankly appalling. On her deathbed, Sylvia wrote out her final wishes regarding the guardianship of her 5 boys. She explicitly stated she wanted her mother, her brother Guy, her sister-in-law, and her children's nurse, Mary Hodgson, to care for them. What does the diminutive sociopath do? He copies her handwritten notes to present to the family, and in an act of breathtaking, utterly disgraceful fraud, he alters the text. He conveniently changes a crucial name, likely Jenny, the nurse's sister, or Jimmy, referring to a different relative, to read that he, Jimmy Barrie, should be the primary guardian. He legally hijacked 5 human children through sheer deceit. There is no otter way to describe it, but kidnapping via forgery. And thus, the lost boys were entirely his. But life under the thumb of a man who refuses to acknowledge reality is a cursed existence. Let us examine the body count of Barrie's dreadful interference. First, George the eldest. He is sent off to the trenches of World War I. In 1915, he is blown to pieces by a sniper's bullet in Flanders. Barrie, true to form, processes this profound loss by entirely centering himself, mourning the loss of his boy rather than the horrific waste of a young man's life. Then, we have Michael, arguably Barrie's favorite, the boy who served as the primary inspiration for Peter Pan's personality. Michael attends Oxford, desperate to escape Barrie's suffocating neurotic shadow. In 1921, just weeks shy of his 21st birthday, Michael and his close friend and suspected lover, Rupert Buxton, drown in a notorious pool at Sandford Loch. Both were strong swimmers. It was almost certainly a self-harm act, a desperate bid to escape the unbearable weight of existence. Barrie naturally refused to accept this reality, preferring to believe a whimsical lie about them simply drifting away. Absolute rubbish. And what of Peter Davies, the very namesake of the cursed play? Peter harbored a lifelong burning resentment for Barrie and the inescapable shadow of the character. He famously referred to Peter Pan as that terrible masterpiece. He founded a publishing house, suffered from severe depression and alcoholism, and finally, in 1960, having had enough of the agonizing legacy, threw himself under a train at the Sloane Square London Underground station. Jack, John Llewellyn Davies, the second eldest. Now, Jack is perhaps the only glimmer of hope in this entire miserable narrative, because he was the sole member of that brood who possessed a functioning spine and a basic instinct for self-preservation. From the very moment Barrie began lurking in Kensington Gardens like a well-dressed fungus, Jack despised him. He saw through the parlor tricks and the extravagant gifts. He deeply resented the way Barrie usurped his actual hard-working father, Arthur. While the other boys were busy being brainwashed into Barrie's neurotic fantasy of perpetual childhood, Jack actively rebelled. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with the infantile pandemonium of Peter Pan. How does one escape an emotionally stunted, controlling playwright? One joins the Royal Navy. Jack fled to the sea just before World War I, preferring the brutal reality of military service to the suffocating, whimsical prison of Barrie's affection. He later married a woman named Geraldine Crisp, and naturally, Barrie's involvement was virtually non-existent. Jack maintained a cold, distant relationship with the creepy little scribbler for the rest of his life, carrying a bitter and entirely justified grudge. He eventually died of lung disease in 1959. It is an utterly grim conclusion, but at least Jack had the dignity to grow up and reject the absolute rubbish Barrie was peddling about her. Then we have the youngest, Nicholas, mercifully known as Nico. Nico was merely a swaddled infant when the play was first staged in 1904. Because he was essentially a prop during the height of Barrie's obsession with George and Michael, he inadvertently avoided the worst of the psychological meddling. He was not the muse, he was the afterthought. By the time Nico was old enough to comprehend the situation, both his parents were dead, and Barrie had forged his way into becoming their legal guardian. Bloody hell, Barrie still hovered over him, paying for his education at Eton and Oxford, but Nico approached the situation with a remarkably pragmatic, almost mercenary detachment. He didn't idolize Barrie, nor did he actively loathe him the way Jack and Peter did. Nico simply treated Barrie as a deeply eccentric, deep-pocketed uncle. He recognized that Barrie was an asexual, emotionally stunted oddity, but managed to simply shrug it off. Against all odds, Nico achieved what none of the other boys could, an utterly mundane, normal human existence. He married, had a daughter, carved out a career in publishing, and lived a quiet life until his death in 1980. He was the sole survivor who managed to navigate the toxic, suffocating wealth of James Matthew Barrie without ending up blown to bits in a trench, drowned in a river, or thrown under a London Underground train. As for Barrie himself, he died in 1937, a shriveled, lonely husk of a man. In a final calculated PR stunt masquerading as philanthropy, he left the copyright of Peter Pan to the Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children. A brilliant, manipulative move to ensure that anyone who dared criticize his deeply creepy legacy would look as though they were stealing money from dying orphans. A complete and utter shambles from beginning to end. 5 lives ruined, a family obliterated, all so a stunted, traumatized little man could pretend he never had to grow up, and you peasants clapped for it. I am entirely depleted by the staggering weight of human inadequacy. This story is concluded. I am going to order my kitchen staff to prepare a massive, piping hot English pancake drowned in lemon and sugar, and I shall attempt to forget your species exists for the remainder of the evening. Do not forget to subscribe to this wretched channel, though I cannot fathom why you would subject yourselves to my flawless intellect if you are unwilling to learn from it. Cheerio!